Hey guys, it's Tuesday. I'm Matt, and this week's topic is about gender versus sexuality. Um, so the differences between gender and sexuality are extensive because they're not at all the same idea or concepts. Um, First, I'll start off by defining gender, or how I define gender. And gender is a socially constructed role that you decide for yourself, um, and you participate in. So, for example, like my gender is male, and my gender um, is the way I perceive myself, and I dress accordingly. I, take on the social role of male. Um, Therefore, others perceive me as male as well. And gender influences the way society treats us. So, sexism, exists for those who are like gendered female, um, like dominance or power or privilege is associated with those whose gender are male. So basically, gender is just socially constructed ideas and social roles. Whereas sexuality, when I define sexuality, I use it as kind of like an umbrella term. I think a lot of people, when they use the term sexuality, they're talking about one sexual orientation. So whether they're gay, straight, or bisexual, or all the other sexualities or sexual orientations underneath the umbrella of sexual orientations. Um, when I use the term sexuality, I'm not only talking about one's sexual orientation, so who they like to have sex with, but I'm also kind of talking about one's willingness and openness to participating in activities or in conversations that revolve around sex or sex life, and how open they are to that. So, for example, like if one has a high sexuality, I may not be talking about um, necessarily their sex life, them performing sex themselves, but I might be talking about their willingness to read a magazine article about sex positions, or to take a class about sex, um, and to listen to a lecture about sex, or to watch a documentary about sex. So when I use the term sexuality, it's very broad. I don't just narrow it down to sexual orientation. However, for this video, I am going to narrow the term sexuality down to just the definition for sexual orientation. So the differences between, or I should say the difference between gender and sexuality or sexual orientation, um, they're nowhere near the same, because gender is like an identity that we take on, and sexuality or sexual orientation is more of like a preference. It's not an identity that we take. I mean, granted, like there are cultures, especially within the queer community. There's cultures that go in in hand with sexualities. For example, the lesbian culture. Being a lesbian, that's someone's sexuality, but there's a culture behind it as well. Same with the gay culture, the trans culture. There's trans culture, but that's gender. So with sexuality, it's it's who you want to be with or who you're attracted to, not who you define yourself as. Um, Society, I mean, I was gonna say society treats those of different genders differently, but now that I'm thinking about it, society also treats those of different sexualities differently. Hence, you know, just in 2015, all 50 states in the United States of America are being able to, have same-sex marriage, and before then, it was limited to only a handful of states with that opportunity for same-sex marriages to occur, that is a form of discrimination. So, um, I mean, society does treat people different based on their sexuality as well as their gender. So, yeah, they do have similarities with that. But all in all, gender and sex and gender and sexual orientation, they're not the same thing. I'm just going to tell you guys a quick story. When I first came out as transgender, I wrote a really long letter to my mom and I mailed it to her, and she was extremely confused with what I was telling her in this letter, because basically in this letter it was a really long letter and I went really in depth, probably too in depth for her information, like too much information, I'm sure, but I wanted to make sure that I was as thorough as possible, and I felt like a letter I'd be able to literally write everything I needed to get off my chest, and I did. I used it for that advantage. But so basically, after she read my letter, she was extremely confused because she doesn't know how to differentiate, and she's never been told that there was a difference between sex, gender, and sexuality or sexual orientation. So I had to break it down to her, like, Mom, sex is your biological sex, your chromosomes, your body parts. Gender is how you choose to live. Whether you have female body parts or male body parts, gender is how you choose to express yourself and how you want society to treat you, and all that. And then I had to explain to her sexual orientation has nothing to do with your gender, and she was so convinced that it had to coincide. She thought that I was deciding to come out as transgender and start hormones and go through a gender and sex change, for my wife's sake, so the world would perceive us as a straight couple and not a gay couple or a lesbian couple. And she thought that, you know, with that being said, this was all something that was fueled by my sexual orientation or my sexuality. And um, I was like, no, Mom, like, this has nothing to do with my life. This has nothing to do with anybody that I'm with. Nothing at all. So, um, I had to have that kind of conversation with my mom about how my gender expression has literally nothing to do with who I want to have sex with at all. Like, I can have sex with men or women, and I'm still gonna be a trans guy in the end. I'm still gonna identify as male gender in this society. So yeah. Um, so all in all, I would say sexuality and gender, when you guys, when people are minorities, gender minorities or sexual orientation minorities, um, they have similar disadvantages in society. They get treated with prejudice, discrimination, so on and so forth. But the actual concept of gender and the concept of sexual orientation or sexuality, are not the same thing. So I think that is important to stress, and I think more individuals need to be educated about what gender means, what sex means, and then what sexuality or sexual orientation means, and how, though it may seem like it's all the same thing, it's clearly not. It's very different. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll post a video next week.